Colorful Characters in Early 20th Century Alaska. My name is Eric Johnson. I'm a historian of the National Park Service. I'm also on the board of the Alaska Historical Society. Today we have 3 presentations. The first one is going to be by David Greenham, who is with us via Zoom. David is passionate about the arts, humanities, and history. He just completed a 3-year tenure as executive director of the Maine Arts Commission and is a lecturer in drama at the University of Maine at Augusta. David's never been to Alaska and is ready to visit as soon as he can. For the past 20 years, he's been in possession of more than 200 letters, paintings, student writing assignments, and photographs from his great uncle, William Franklin Park, who arrived in Alaska in 1935, worked in placer mines, and taught in small public schools in rural Alaska before retiring to his cabin in Lake Clark. And that's where he lived until the early 1960s. During COVID, David began the process of transcribing the many letters, working to identify the photos. The presentation for this AHS conference is the first time any of this information has been made public. So David, I'll let you take it away.
Oh, great. Hello. Good evening from Maine. My name is David Greenham. It's a real honor to join you today for this conference. My great uncle, Bill Park, spent most of 1933 in Louverre, Colorado. Despite the fact that it was the height of the Depression, he had managed to get a job at the Louverre Works, DuPont's most important dynamite plant. Louverre Works seems to have provided TNT for many of the major public works expansion projects in the West, including the building of the Hoover Dam. Now, the photo that's here of Bill was taken when he was in Alaska, probably in the early 1930s, or the late 1930s, sorry. And a note on the back of the photo claims that he's holding the lower jaw of a mastodon. The painting is a view from one of Bill's students, although it's not clear that it was a student in council. I suspect it and the other paintings in this presentation are actually from students in Mary's Igloo, which is where Bill went after the council school was closed. For years, it seems that Bill Park longed to live in Alaska. He'd grown up in Western Pennsylvania and served in the Army for 14 months in World War I and graduated from Penn State University. It was understood among his 3 siblings, Hal, Sarah, and my grandfather, Joe, that Bill was the one with wanderlust. So I don't think it came as much of a surprise when he wrote from Colorado to my grandfather in January of 1934, "I have a great mind to go to Alaska." My research suggests that he might have been inspired by Robert W. Service's popular 1916 book, The Spell of the Yukon and Other Verses. Bill quotes him in The Land Beyond, a short story that he wrote in his cabin at Lake Clark sometime in the late 50s. Let us probe the silent places. Let us seek what luck betide us. Let us journey to a lonely land I know. So on June 1st, 1935, Bill ate a big breakfast of fried salmon. He paid $0.25 for that in a restaurant in Seattle, and then boarded the SS Yukon just over a decade before that ship's famous wreck. Bill loved the journey, and when he arrived in Seward 6 days later, he declared it the greatest trip I ever took. In Seward, he was packing his belongings on the dock when he was approached by a man asking if Bill was looking for work. Sure enough, within a day or two, Bill was in Hope, where he'd landed a job working at a placer mine 4 miles up Resurrection Creek. For the next several years, Bill jumped around. He was in Fairbanks, Miller House, Akiak, College, Takotna, Ophir, Larsen Bay, and Flat before ending up in council during the winter of 1947. Along the way, he built a cabin at Lake Clark, which is where he retired. Bill described council at length in a letter dated March 18th, 1947, to my Aunt Barbara, who would have been 16 years old at the time. He told her of council's mining history. During the height of the gold rush, council was a city of 20,000 people. He wrote, "Now you could scarcely guess the former grandeur and glory. Some of the houses are still standing, but they are all bent and leaning and decrepit and crippled, with porches rotting off and roofs caving in. In the telephone exchange is the switchboard, all intact. And in the courthouse is a library of costly leather-bound law books left to decay." The council that Bill Park found in 1947 had a winter population of 23 people. But it was a beautiful place, he wrote. Along the Nuckaluk is a broad, flat river valley. Away from the flat, long hills rise at most places with a gentle grade, but with an occasional blood toward the river. On the lower slopes are some scraggly, scattered spruce trees. Most of the trees for 5 or 6 miles were cut when council was a thriving place. North and west of the river, the hills are bare except for some willow brush. All the hilltops are bare, sometimes showing a ledge of rock through the snow. Beyond these hills are more hills, and beyond the last hill are higher hills, mountains, if you please, some of them with steep peaks. Bill described the wildlife that once included herds of caribou, reindeer, and mountain sheep. "There are 2 kinds of rabbits," he wrote. "One is about the size of your rabbit, and the other is as big as a collie dog. I've never seen one of these big Arctic hares, but I've seen their tracks. Some years they are plentiful, and some years scarce. The same is true for ptarmigan. This is a scarce year." In the summer, trout and grayling come up the river in considerable numbers. Salmon also run. Julius Tutpin says that as soon as it gets at all warm, we can catch grayling through holes the water has opened in the ice. He uses a lure that he makes of copper, and the grayling, he says, will take nothing else. Bill Park enjoyed hunting and particularly loved fishing. In fact, he wrote a magazine article about fishing somewhere near Iliamna Lake. The feature story, entitled "A Torrent of Trout," was published in the December 1939 edition of the magazine Outdoor Life. But even the editor of the magazine hinted at Bill's desire to live a quieter life. He wrote that Bill sent the article and then, quote, retreated still farther into the wilderness as if he didn't want to hear any more about it. But what Bill seemed to love most was teaching school. He taught in Pennsylvania before heading west, and soon after he arrived in Alaska, he pulled enough money together to take education courses at the University of Alaska, and he was soon teaching. My great-aunt Sarah, his sister, was also a teacher in Pennsylvania, so his letters to her were filled with updates about the students, many photos, and even some of their papers and artworks, such as this letter from Larson Bay student Alberta Aga. But there was something about being in council that seems to really have made him happy. Prior to that, most of the photos are landscapes and rivers or photos of his cabin in Lake Clark. But in council, he seemed to love to take photos of the kids. He made multiple copies of each, and so I'm sure he gave them to their families, as well as sending them along to Sarah and his nieces, his brother Hal's daughter, Dorothy, and Joe's children, my Aunt Barbara and my mother, Catherine. These and the next slides are really just pictures of the kids. He clearly loved them all. Wherever he was, almost all of his letters, he mentioned what the kids were doing, how they were succeeding, and how confident he was that they could hold their own against kids anywhere in any school. In May 1947, he talked about the end of the school year. "Yesterday, we had a school picnic to which the whole village came. We went down to the beach along the river, made a fire, had coffee, lemonade, sandwiches, beans, macaroni salad, pickles, and candy and cake. I was surprised to learn that he'd spent the summer of 1947 taking classes in teaching art and music here in Maine at the University of Maine in Orono. He then made the 11-day journey back from Maine to Council. And on August 31st, he wrote, "School is due to open next Thursday after Labor Day. But this morning, McIvers came over telling me of huckleberries by the barrel. Fruit is scarce and expensive. We talked it over and decided not to open school for a week so everyone could pick huckleberries. I am invited to go out to the camp and will be leaving before long." In a letter dated September 20th, he wrote, "School started a week ago. There were 12 the first day, but more drifted in until we had 18. I did not put Jimmy Porter on the roll, for he was not 6 until next month, and he was in school only 3 days till his folks went back to Nome. The kids range from 7 to 17. The Apoc family has 9 children. They have 6 children in school. 3 others will go back to White Mountain at the end of the mining season. Since I sent for supplies for only 6 children, and since we have only 14 desks, we have some problems, but we get along. The kids are fairly bright and not much better behaved than many groups I have seen in the States. Nearly all the grades are represented, and we have to double up grades as well as with books. It didn't take long until there was talk about the holidays. The children are already asking whether we will have exercises at Christmas, and we all seem to want to do so. Now I will need gifts. Do you want to bother to shop for them? If you will, pay anything within reason, and I will send you a check. Aunt Sarah was always happy to help out with presents for the kids." Now, part of the joy of reading Bill Park's letters is that he was a really opinionated guy. He hated FDR, who once or twice he refers to as Franklin Breadtax Roosevelt. And he wasn't always so keen on our traditions. For example, in the same letter where he asked for Christmas gifts for the kids, he wrote, "Sometimes I do not think much of this custom of giving presents at Christmas time. Certainly it has been worked up by the stores until it becomes a sort of orgy by which the stores are the chief beneficiaries. Give presents to the kids, of course. To someone else, if you know something that the person wants and cannot readily get it, or if there was something really nice that you think some person might like. Otherwise, gifts are an awful waste. I have had many gifts given to me that served no purpose. I appreciate the giving and render due gratitude to the giver, but a nice letter would have given me much more pleasure than a useless gift. Also, I hate to receive a gift in return for one I have given. If I give something, I give it, and at least get the pleasure out of the gift or not. I hate to think, now I will have to give him or her a gift because he or she sent me one last year. I vote thumbs down on duty giving. Though truly, if I had something nice that I thought you would like, I would send it to you. I have not. Thus, according to the above theory, I send you these pictures." Well, the pictures were a lovely gift, and as it turned out, thankfully, Great Aunt Sarah kept them all. Many of Bill's pictures of his students are really beautiful, I think. In one letter, he described some of the members of the Apoc family and another student, Josephine Ione. Ethel and Annie, 17 and 15, left school and returned to White Mountain. Mr. Hill of the White Mountain School was here and invited the girls to go to the boarding school that is now well organized in process. The girls were all excited at the prospect, for they preferred to be in the bigger village and among others of their age. Both these girls play piano, Ethel quite nicely. All the Apocs sing well, even little Roberta, 4 years old. Marjorie, 11, 4th grade, left-handed, is a little artist. I think I will send you one of her pictures of Donald Duck. She is a smart little girl with a nimble mind, and I was asking their native language names and asked her what mine was, Like a flash, she answered, Chaneku, which means bones. Look at Mary. Her face tells all about her. She learns. Mary's in 3rd grade. Martha, 2nd grade, is prettier than this picture shows. She really is a cute little tyke, all squirmy and can't stay still unless she is reading or doing some other work. That little sister can read almost anything. I told Mrs. Aust to have her read sometime in Sunday school class. She read the Bible, and little Martha seldom stumbled on a word. Robert, his sister Marjorie says, oh, he's dumb. But he's not. Robert is supposed to be in the 5th grade, but is not really good as a 5th grader. He's just a growing up boy, and about like many others of his age. Josephine Ion is in their grade. She would be in 4th or 5th grade according to her age, but she was out of school for a while before I came. She's a nice little girl and gets along well in her grade. She has no father, and her mother is a tiny little woman with an injured leg so that she uses a crutch all the time. He often shares samples of his students' writing assignment, or at least drafts of them. Here's one about fishing from Rosie Miller. He also shared the text of a story by precocious 3rd grader Mary Epoch, entitled The Dolls I Have. Mary wrote, I have a pig doll, and its name is Sarah, and a tiny doll that I made, but I didn't name it yet. I'm going to make clothes for it. I made a dress for it. I am going to knit boots and stockings for it. I'm going to make a cap for it. I might name it tonight. Its name might be Roseanne. I'm going to make my big doll boots. I'm going to make my big doll a long dress. By spring, Bill wrote, my infant prodigies are performing well. A one-room school is by all accepted standards an obsolete institution, almost below contempt. Yet in letters exchanged with schools in various places, it would appear that these children do about as well as city children of the same ages and grades. Did you ever feel that your education in a country school was a handicap? Certainly these children know more about the states than those outside know about Alaska. We exchanged letters with Islington, Massachusetts, and some of those children asked if they had ever seen a car or gone to the movies and proceeded to describe such things. These youngsters were amused and half annoyed. Marjorie says, I'm going to ask them if they've ever heard of an airplane. I'm going to tell them that it has wings and flies in the air. Marjorie is 12 years old today. On January 1st, 1949, he wrote to Sarah, Christmas came as usual, with the usual Christmas tree and program and the usual month of work it takes to get a program ready. There was not much stuff to work with. I read over all the Christmas plays and did not find them good. These kids have never practiced committing stuff to memory, and I know plays were out anyway. Some of the Christmas verses in the books on hand had as poor a rhythm, awkward rhyming as the worst of the old Argus obituaries. I reorganized some stuff to suit myself. The Epochs, my best singers of last year, were gone. Nels and Julia sing lustily, but without tune. Lola has a strong voice, but is usually a half a beat behind the rest. But we beat the thing into shape and put on a not-too-bad show. Looking for something different, I pounded my skull and rattled a couple of old tunes, and some fragments of words fell out of the loose brain, and we sang them along with Christmas carols. David Henry Agluin was Santa Claus. Gifts? You never saw the like for the size of the crowd. I had picked up a few things in Anchorage last fall, but there wasn't much, and I did not have many ideas as to what to get. So I wrote to Lois McIver, one of the Aust daughters, at Nome, and asked her to get gifts for the others. She did just that and even said it was fun. She wrapped all the packages and put names on them. There were shirts, jackets, sweaters, and other things for the girls, a pair of skating shoes for Donald. Anna Plimpton mailed a box this year that went out on the last boat from Seattle and arrived on time. There were scarves, hair ribbons, and bows for the girls, and neckties for the boys. Really nice things. We had our school program on Thursday night. Christmas Eve, the Austs had their own little gathering with a fine dinner, and I was a guest. I was there Christmas night when the Sunday school gave its program at the Aust home with all the village present. Again were quantities of gifts given. The Henrys gave furs to the big girls. I think they had little else to give, yet the gifts were expensive things if measured in cash value. This week was vacation. I think we needed it. For the first of the week, it was cold and blustery, but yesterday was fine and calm. It is still that way this morning, with a temperature at 50 below zero, which is not as cold as 20 below with a wind. During his final year at council, Bill wrote to my Aunt Barbara, 11 pupils attend school, 3 doing high school work, and the others scattered in all the grades. Mr. Ryan, the Commissioner of Education, came to see us early in the fall. Otherwise, our school has been our own, and we do as we please. When an occasional plane arrives, we can stop school and go out and look at it. And when the days were very short, we let out school soon after dark. Our nearest neighbors are 40 miles down the river, 26, I think, by air, and we do not quarrel with them. The whole country is our own, with no one to dispute our title. Once in a while, a dog sled or a plane arrives, and people go and come to a certain extent, but the population of the village has been something between 30 and 40 through the winter thus far. By December of 1949, he wrote, most of the time, it is very pleasant teaching the small group. Early in the fall, there was an epidemic of measles that shot attendance for a month. Since then, there's been no sickness. A couple of guys came and brought a case of the sniffles and made runny noses, but that was all. Most of our toilet paper goes for handkerchiefs during such times. By the fall of 1950, Bill was teaching in Mary's Igloo, where, as I mentioned, I think several of the student paintings in this presentation came from. It seems that wherever he went, Bill Park made many lasting friends with the families of his students. He often talks in his letters about going to people's houses for meals and heading out fishing or picking berries with the families. He always expressed enthusiasm for the kids. Here's a picture of Bill in 1954. In one letter, he shares that he had agreed to watch the youngest of the Aust children while the family was traveling. You should know Mamie, he wrote. She is 5 years old, the cutest little girl I ever saw. When she talks, her face talks. If movie actresses could put as much expression in their faces, they would be something. So I'll let Mamie's mugging for the camera be the final images for you. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, David. And in the interest of time, we're going to save all the questions for the very end. No, we've got to start. So we're going to move on to our second presenter, Jackie Pelz. Jackie was born in Seward and reared mostly in coastal Alaska. She graduated from the Kenai Territorial High School in 1953 from the School of Journalism at the University of California, Berkeley. 30 years and 16 years later. At Hardscratch Press, named for an early 1900s family cod fishing station in the Shumagon Islands, she and her designer partner David Johnson have published more than 24 books of real people's history, including her own Unga Island Girl, Ruth's book, Any Tonnage, Any Ocean, Conversations with a Resolute Alaskan, Family After All, Alaska's Jessie Lee Home, belonging to Seward, and Framed by the Sea and Sky, Community Art in Seward, Mural Capital of Alaska.
In 1994, I was an accidental publisher by day and a copy editor at the San Francisco Chronicle at night, until trouble grew, the strike was called, And suddenly the days were devoted to marching around and around the building, with an occasional chant begun somewhere in the right. One morning I arrived to hear that we were to head to a big rally in Union Square. Afterward, on the way back to 901 Mission Street, I fell into step and conversation with a union man from Chicago. He had questions about our San Francisco situation, and then, maybe by way of comparison, told of a book he'd read recently that described dangerous working conditions in all sorts of weather, no safety standing, no union support, a book titled Bridging Alaska. A book written by my late stepfather and published by me and then read in Chicago. Not so unlikely in this electronic age, I guess, but 30 years ago. Dad had good reviews, but did people in Chicago read the Juneau Empire or even Seattle PI? Before I got over my astonishment, it was back to marching, and I'm sorry to say I know nothing more about Chicago Man, but his focus has influenced my rereading of the book first having printed. Dad certainly had some weather stories, but his caption on this 1935 photo of a bridge over the Medina River is about the only method of making working conditions. Heading out to the job after breakfast, he wrote, the crews worked 7 days a week with no overtime or holiday pay for $150 a month. Using my Kenai Territorial School of Math, she says proudly, that's not quite 63 cents an hour in a 30-day month. But in the Depression years, that was more than many were making, the ones who had a job. Before Chicago Man, I hadn't put it in context. A few years after the strike was settled, I had a call from a man at Alaska DOT asking to speak to Mr. Silver. I'd like to also, I said, and explained why neither of us would be able to. But can I help? We're talking about replacing a bridge Ralph Silver worked on, he said. We're pretty much familiar with the technical aspect, but we're hungry for the story. Emphasis is. I offered to contact several men I was acquainted with from growing up in the Kenai Road camp, men who had worked with Dad over the years. They all echoed historian Al Hirschberger, who hired on with the ARC, where's Clark, in the late 40s. Jackie, he said, what I know about the Iliamna Bridge, I read in Ralph's book, Image. A paragraph in this ADN story is another sort of echo. The bridge was built in the 1930s, but there are discrepancies in its exact history. The DOT's archaeological survey says it was first built in 1934 to cross Eagle River in south central Alaska and was moved to the Iliamna River in 1946. But the book, Bridging Alaska, by Ralph Silver, is perhaps Silver's first-hand account of building the bridge over the Iliamna River in 1936. Here's Ralph Silver on the Iliamna job. We found a mess at Iliamna Bay, he wrote. For today's schedule, this will be a highly condensed account of the building bridge. Everything had just been unloaded and ready to drive off the beach. We pitched our tents and a cook tent at the river, where we built a pile driver and drove false work across. On the south side, we had to drive long steel piling for a steel pier. We drove them down as far as we could, and then, I'm not sure how such a thing could happen. We ran out of oxygen for the cutting tools. We had to leave the piling where the steel cap was to be placed, sticking up in the air. Finally, we got to the end of the bridge and still no oxygen. The last boat of the season out of Cook Inlet was due to pick us up in less than a week. One night I woke up about 3 a.m. stewing about this and had a thought. By golly, I can rig up a big hacksaw frame. Several broken hacksaw blades and more stewing later, the story continues. Sam Depute was a Frenchman who later worked for me on the crusher in the Kinley Park. I said, come on, Sam, let's see what we can do with a hacksaw blade.
Jackie, would you speak up? Would you project a little bit more if you can? They can't hear you online very well.
Oh, sorry, online. Hey, online. Let's see what we can do with a hacksaw blade. He said, we can't do much with it. Well, I said, we can try. Whereupon, a 16-pound sledgehammer and a big steel chisel joined the hacksaw, and in the author's words, by golly, inside of an hour we had cut off a piling. The crew were standing around laughing at us. They thought we were crazy. Before the date was over, we had all of the piling cut off. They put the caps on the piling, and 3 crewmen used hand drills to drill the holes for the bolts instead of cutting them with the cutting torch we didn't have. Image. In 2 or 3 days, we had the pile driver off the bridge and over to the other bridge site across the swamp. We made a quick deal of that one. The back cover of the original Bridging Alaska carries a quote from a reader of Ralph's previous book. What we like best about Confessions of an Alaska Bootlegger, she wrote, is that it sounds just like you telling your stories face to face. Reviewer Sherry Simpson, who is now very much missed, wrote, though Sober confesses that his limited formal education at times made him feel inadequate. That was 5 years of school in Norway before he came to the U.S. He clearly succeeded by being a quick learner. He tells his stories in a straightforward, clear fashion. Fashion. So, no call for heavy-handed editing, quite the opposite. But Knik River did offer a couple of challenges. The logistics for the Knik River Bridge were complex, he wrote. There were 6 spans, each 250 feet long. We had to build a separate shack for the bolts and nuts and washers alone because there were so many different sizes. By this time, it was plenty cold, but I was beginning to wonder whether we would get the job done before the ice on the river went out and took the false work with it. We steamed and scraped away at the heavy frost as we excavated. Finally, he says, they ran into a huge boulder that they just couldn't handle, and he and Johnny Highland made plans on their own to blast it out. Except what he actually wrote was, finally we ran into a boulder the size of a Volkswagen that we just couldn't handle, so we made plans to blast it out. As editor, I can see that, but it doesn't feel right. Not to be too literal, but it was research time, minus the internet, at least at our house. The first Volkswagen was introduced to the world 2 years later. Editor writes to author, no email. Author writes back. Finally, we ran into a boulder the size of a couch that we just couldn't handle. Too domestic. Finally, we ran into a boulder the size of a black bear. Too bloody. But then, finally, we ran into a boulder the size of a 3-seater outhouse that we just couldn't handle. Editor upload, as did Sherry Simpson, whose review continues. And like a true storyteller, he has a feel for language, describing a boulder as the size of a 3-seater outhouse. Both of us happy. The story concludes. By now, the weather was so cold that we couldn't even get the air compressor started to break the boulder up. Johnny Highland and I had done some blasting on the Juneau Douglas job. We dug a tunnel under and behind the boulder, big enough for a man to crawl in, and then packed 3 cases of dynamite in the tunnel, ran the fuse out to the derrick, which ran the clamshell. We swung the boom to one side and pulled the derrick back about 10 feet from the hole. When the crew went in for lunch, we set the image thing off. The crew screamed out of the cook shack when they heard the sound, and Gilly only clambered across the bridge to ask Johnny and me what the hell we were doing. By this time, we were rid of the rock, which had curved back down and gone through the ice, and the blast had also broken up the frozen ground where we were digging, which helped a lot. Gilly only was angry, but he had to laugh. Toward the end of Bridging Alaska, Ralph wrote, maybe ornery is what we had to be to get the job done. My quiet wife still says to me once in a while when I get pushing on a project, now listen, Mr. Silver, I'm not on one of your road crew. With that full speed ahead spirit in mind, I tried to pester him as little as possible. I guess it was just a tired day on the Knik River when I slumped over the keyboard and sighed on the telephone to designer partner David, what's a spud wrench? David said quite sensibly, John McPhee would just say, a spud wrench is. But I'm not John McPhee, and neither is Dad, and this had to be in his voice. I left it for the time being, and then the mail brought another batch of photos from the author. Problem solved in 7 words. God bless photo caption. Studying workaday photos like this photo and an Ileana shot we've chosen for the back cover of the book helped me really appreciate the Nipper saga. I acquired a good companion on the big Delta job, Ralph wrote, a knee-high Springer Spaniel named Nipper that I borrowed from Ben Stewart. Nipper was white with brown spots, a wonderful hunting dog, and he loved the water image. Ben often brought Nipper up to the camp when he came to check on us, and the dog enjoyed those visits and the special treatment he got from the cook especially. Ben lived alone in Fairbanks, and it was awkward for him to take care of Nipper in town, so I suggested he leave the dog at camp. Nipper and I got along just fine. He shared my tent, and that was wonderful companionship for me. Image. This is that back cover shot at Ileanda for background here. Towards spring, when we were out over the river in the field, he'd follow me right out onto the beam. I was worried that he might fall, but he was fearless. One day when the steel was all hooked up and we were waiting to pour concrete for the abutment on the north side, Nipper followed me to the bridge and then sat crying when I climbed up the batterford, which is the inclined beam that runs from the pier to the top of the bridge. He tried, but he couldn't climb it. I went back down, lifted him by the collar, and boosted him up the batter post until it got level enough so he could walk on it. I never saw such a dog. He just walked real slow, looking from side to side. These dare dog adventures continued until, as Ralph tells it, Ben Stewart got married in Juneau 2 years later, and I lost Nipper. Happy to say the friendships continued. Many decades. I'm also blessed in friendships, including the two responsible for many of those good bridging reviews. It was Dad and David Johnson, then an artist at the local paper where we both worked, who talked me into taking on Dad's first book, intended to be the last book of any of us. I just want you to know. And David had designed every page and cover in the 33 years and 30-some books since. John Boring, now also greatly missed, that was his artwork. Was an artist on the Chronicle staff who taught me into bartering artwork for editing. He was working on a family book of his own. The maps in Bridging Alaska are John's work, including this one, where he and David accommodated my expat insistence that our books would not follow the practice of an Alaska map with a little box containing the illusion. One reviewer had Ralph Sober building bridges at every location on those chapter titles, which may be all he read in the book, but it was a nice review. A Bristol Bay Bridge would be something to write about. As to Homer, Ralph does write. We have a nasty job, said Holly Sterling, but all of the guys we've got, you're about the only one who fits the socket. The road down to Homer's Bay had washed out, he said. There was no transportation to the dock at the end. They had decided that a foundation of 500 to 1,000 feet of log cribbing would have to be built and filled with mud to support a new section of roads across Mud Bay. I shook my head, picturing it. Where are you going to get the log? Yeah, Sterling said. You're going to have to hire some men and put in a camp across from the spit toward Halibut Cove. You'll have to do your own logging and raft them over to Homer, or get a fishing boat to bring them over. But you're pretty well acquainted with that kind of work. And he said, we've got to get started early so we can get it finished before the big tides come in the fall. Inside of a week or two, we were organized, and a raft of logs had arrived. We started building the cribbing image. And rebuild. People in this very room have driven the spit, right? So we know how the chapter ends. According to Ralph, Holly Sterling did it again mid-project and said, you've sure got a hell of a mess here. Funny, we had no trouble engineering this in the office. Image. In December of 1947, Ralph wrote, I got married. Ruth and I had known each other while growing up on Unga Island out in the Shulgans at the head of the Aleutian chain, where both our families settled when they came from Norway. All these years later, we met again in Seward. I had a big job on my hands. Not only did I have to win this beautiful little Norwegian woman who remembered me strictly as the rough boy at Hardscratch Point with all those nice brothers, I had to win the friendship for two young daughters, ages 6 and 10, and their protector, a part Wolf Mackenzie husky. But I was pretty determined. The dog, called Cusco for the Kuskokwim River, adopted me after a while, but I was actually afraid of him at first. He was a quiet dog with a pale red gold coat, started still over here, with a pale red gold coat, but you could see the wolf in him. If a stranger walked up, the dog would just stand there and stare him down. He wouldn't move nor would his tail wag. It hung straight down. Strangers stopped and backed away from him. Cusco took the girls, Jerry and Jackie, to school every day, and then went straight back to the house. At 3 o'clock, he'd be at the school, waiting to take them home. This is the part where Jackie did not cry, even though. In between, he kept pretty much to himself. Until the day he didn't, which I, the then 10-year-old, remember all too well. Cusco had had a tumultuous life journey of his own and his rough period. When Cusco got to Seward, he was no longer a city dog, if he ever had been one. The story's been told in 2 different books. The pet goat survived, and to everyone's sadness, Cusco was now mostly tethered to his dog. At the time Cusco got into trouble in Seward, Ralph continued, I was in a habit of running into town from our camp at Alcatraz. That's about every day. Couldn't stay away, I guess. After a while, I suggested to Ruth that I take Cusco out to camp with me. He could have more freedom out there. She agreed. Gradually, we relaxed with each other, and by golly, finally it was okay. He stayed with me all the time. He'd sleep outside my tent or inside with me if he wanted, and he went with me on all my road jobs. Off and on during the next couple of years, he and I must have walked the entire 120 miles from Cooper Landing to home, at least twice. He still loved Ruth and the girls, but he was my dog now. I never disabused Dad of that notion, but the fact is, each of us 4 felt the same way. In 2023, I'm still an accidental publisher by day and occasional nights. The 2020 photo makes it look a lot tidier than it is. Far, far left in the cover, Ralph Sobert's first book, as I said, intended as the only ever for all of us, not quite 4 inches tall, 6 inches wide, 64 pages. Missing are the 3 most recent books and 1 more historic canine comrade. Warren Jewett was in his 90s and still working on his own as a commercial fisherman aboard his trawler when he and author Bruce Schwartz became friends. In his 20s, Warren had traveled from Seattle to Ketchikan 34 midwinter days in a homemade skiff with his black cocker spaniel Patsy as the only crew. She's peeking over the side in this 1930s film. She was a little like any female, Warren told Bruce, meaning curious. When the weather got rough, she'd stick her head out from under the tarp they both slept under, and I'd have to push her back in for protection. Patsy gets my vote for inclusion here, the loyal companion and colorful historic character. Warren, too. After good measure, Ralph. Mary Mullen, that volume. He's good that man. Mary Mullen's second volume of poems is arranged in 3 sections: Alaska, Ireland, Oregon. The cabbages in the title poem grew a few miles from where we are now. In her acknowledgments, Mary mentions a neighbor family. Ruth and Ralph Sober taught me that the best thing a person can ever be is a good neighbor who believes in nurturing children, especially the kids down the hill. Second printing of Ralph's 3rd book includes some new references for extra reading and an obituary. Ralph's last road job before his 2nd retirement was at Point Barrow for the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But we're going to stop right where we are, literally, with thanks to Al Hirschberger for the loan of his Sterling Highway dedication photos. As you see in the lady lower scene, I love that. The word goes on. No one ever took DOT up on that Iliamna offer. $30,000 and a bridge to do with as you will. Eventually, the universal orange painted steel was melted down and the sleek new structure built. I spoke to someone in Juneau from the bridge's offices, and she said, I have my own copy of Bridge. But Al also alerted me to the happy fate of the original Soldotna Bridge. Designer David has put together, and Jackie was lost, but not quite, a card that goes in each book, addendum, and being David the Rabbit. And I just brought a stack of some, and I'll put them on a chair or something, and I only pick one up if you like. It has the link to this story and the one story. And I thank you and the others for being here and smiling.
Final presenter today is Leanna Prax Williams. Liana studies Alaska aviation history and culture in the UAF Interdisciplinary Studies PhD program. She is this year's winner of the Alaska and Polar Regions Collections and Archives McCarthy Research Group Award, which supported this research project.
So don't be afraid to speak up, okay?
Oh, I talk loud.
We'll see.
So, good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. My presentation today is called Whose Territory? The Civil Aeronautics Board or Alaskans? A question that I feel captures the tensions and challenges, connections and disconnections, if you will, in developing aviation prior to statehood in Alaska. If you attended my presentation at last year's conference, you heard me talk about the Civil Aeronautics Act. Well, this year's presentation extends that research by looking at primary source documents showing Alaskans' reactions to one agency created by that act. And I think it's most accurate to say that this presentation illustrates what bothered people enough to write a letter, send a telegram, or sign a petition. So, of course, it can't be considered a comprehensive look at aviation policy, but more at folks' perceptions of it. So while it might seem odd to find this in a session on colorful characters, I found that this research was full of them, from politicians to miners to pilots to just everyday folks around the territory. A wide range of people cared very deeply about air service in Alaska. So this session will feature some of their more colorful remarks on the topic and encompasses the years from the passage of the Civil Aeronautics Act in 1938 up until just before statehood. Next. And again, this project was supported by the Paul McCarthy Research Award, and I just have to say thank you so much to archivists present and past for making this research possible, and for the award supporters for giving me this opportunity. Next. So today we're going to look at a couple of questions. How did the Civil Aeronautics Board alter Alaska aviation from 1938 to 1958? How did Alaskans express their frustrations over the CAB's actions? And what do these documents that I reviewed illustrate about the broader historical context? Next. So to get started, a little background on this act that brought about all these changes. FDR, I'll use Franklin Delano Roosevelt, not our colorful name our previous presenter used, signed the Civil Aeronautics Act into law in June of 1938. And this law represented a major shift for the aviation industry nationwide, also including Alaska. And it created new systems for both development and regulation. Up until that point, Alaska aviation had been very underfunded and had little in the way of weather reporting, navigational infrastructure, and frankly, pretty bleak runways across the territory. Further, it had extremely limited oversight, as some previous regulatory systems didn't apply to the territories. So this law would change that. We see here a breakdown of the administrative systems created by the act. So it reorganized existing administrative functions under the Bureau of Air Commerce, created some new ones, and those were all initially under the umbrella of the Civil Aeronautics Authority. And then they were soon split into the CAA and CAB in a 1940 reorganization. I just love the creative and easy to distinctify acronyms that are. So the CAA, we heard a presenter in the other room in the previous session talk about what the CAA did a little bit. They were air traffic control, safety enforcement, airways development, airfield construction, and they did, certification. The CAB, that's the agency we're focusing on today, did the economic functions, regulatory powers, did accident investigations, and then their goal was to build and support the aviation industry. So CAB was the one that was really the target for a lot of the letter writing. So next, please. CAB, Civil Aeronautics Board. This was economic development and regulation of the industry, among other things. So again, we're looking at the economic regulation side of things today. Next, please. One way that the act aimed to pursue its economic regulation of the aviation industry was by assigning routes and territories, issuing what were called certificates of public convenience and necessity that authorized carriers to fly in particular routes and areas. And this would grant them contracts to carry the mail, and that in turn would provide consistent subsidizing income to those certificated carriers. The act dictated that whoever flew a particular route between April and August of 1938 would have grandfather rights over it. And this, of course, would cause some problems given the seasonal nature of flying work in Alaska and the small size of most operators, just for starters. So to figure out how to assign the routes, the board sent officials to Alaska in 1939 to hold hearings and gather information. And these hearings are the focus of several chapters in different bush pilot memoirs and biographies, the most notable of which is Beth Day's biography of Bob Reeve called Glacier Pilot. So the CAB came and held these hearings, and then it took some time to assign their routes and issue the certificates that would give them authorization to fly, which again meant those mail contracts, the subsidies, and the solid financial footing. So everyone wanted these certificates of convenience and necessity. But what did the contracts end up looking like? What were the routes? Next, please. So this is what the initial route assignments looked like in 1942, with Fairbanks and Anchorage as the major hubs, and then routes down the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers. Nothing much scheduled for north of the Brooks Range. In the upper right-hand corner, I know it's not super clear, but you can see the different certificated carriers. Next, please. So say your community doesn't have regular service. The act did accommodate for that through what were called irregular routes. So different airlines were authorized to fly on a more ad hoc basis to just a different zone around the territory. And several operators might overlap and share a particular area of land for their irregular routes. So they could fly to a destination in this zone on a flexible basis. And before that, competition and what were called star route contracts, a type of mail contract, primarily dictated who flew in an area. So these new certificates of convenience and necessity solidified mail contracts and served to, again, subsidize those carriers. Next, please. So what's the complaining about? The files of the territory's non-voting delegate to Congress, Bob Bartlett, and territorial governor Ernest Greening contain many, many examples of complaints, just boxes of them. Why there? So it's pretty logical, I thought. If people are upset with something that a federal agency is doing, or something that's happening in the territory, they're gonna get in touch with their representative in government. And then these folks are gonna talk to each other to try to figure it out. So what were some of the specific objections to the provisions of the Civil Aeronautics Act and the CAB? Well, right off the bat, the idea of change at all was not well received. Not all of Alaska's pilots reacted well to the idea of change or the idea of oversight and structure, but the war actually ended up interrupting a lot of this stage of complaining, and to a degree, this pre-war status quo held a little bit. And it wasn't really until the winding down of the war before the CAB started enforcing a lot of their regulations, now that the pilots weren't needed to actively support the war effort in Alaska. Next, please. But even after the war, the CAB didn't get off on the right foot. Many felt that the act and the board favored large carriers, especially those based outside Alaska. Small operators especially objected to the new paperwork requirements for operating. And they certainly made their feelings known. They wrote in a letter to the CAB that Instead of living under a democracy, we find ourselves under the iron-handed rule of a bureaucratic dictatorship. So the belief that the board favored large operators and was inflexible would come to be a common complaint. Next, please. After World War II ended, the CAB began to exert more control over in Alaska beyond even these pesky paperwork requirements. They would deny new operators authorization to operate or even shut them down. Why was this such a problem? Well, timing was extremely poor. The Cold War growth period for Alaska meant that there was far more demand for air transport of people and goods than there was capacity from the certificated carriers that were authorized back in the early 1940s when the situation was very different. People, especially those arriving in the military, wanted goods and services more like those they had enjoyed outside, like bringing in fresh groceries, as seen here at the Anchorage Piggly Wiggly. At the same time, large airplanes were being surplused, and pilots that could fly them were returning from service, meaning that there was more air transport supply to meet that growing demand. So enter the irregular, non-scheduled, or non-sched, or pilot operator carriers. And these were, look, excuse me, those that didn't have that all-important certificate of convenience and necessity, but still needed some sort of okay to fly. Alaskans recognized this gap in service far before the CAB came around to it, as events like the longshoremen strikes revealed the role airplanes could play. As Herb Hilcher of the Alaska Development Board wrote, non-skeds today are the backbones of Alaska's economy. Alaskans insist that the CAB must provide for these essential carriers and do so without delay. Well, the board eventually did, begrudgingly, and with a lot of back and forth, make provisions for these carriers. But this class of operator never had the same stability as the fully certificated carriers. And over the 1940s and the 50s, the board tended to change their tune frequently about what role the small operators and non-skeds would serve. Remember, the CAB wanted to limit cutthroat competition and encourage economic development as part of their foundation during the Depression. All my notes, ready? Next, please. And there were many incidences that revealed just this vast gulf between the CAB's actions and the actual needs and wants of Alaska. Definitely another theme in the documents. In 1949, for example, the communities of Manly Hot Springs and Tanana and the surrounding area signed the petition seen here that protested the CAB's decision to change the mail contract from the certificate holding at the time Hot Springs based Brennan Flying Service, and then give the mail contract to a larger Fairbanks based carrier. Manly and Tanana residents were worried that if their communities were served by a larger carrier with fewer ties to the area, service would suffer. Remember that for these communities, bush planes could be their main connection to the outside world, including acting as an ambulance service. So getting a pilot to get in his plane and come could literally be a matter of life or death. So the choice was between the big operator the CAB favored or the small one that the locals felt would best serve them. In this case, fortunately, the locals won out and Brennan did get the certificate back, and that was not always the case. Next, please. So we can see that, especially in the late 1940s, the CAB just didn't get it. Probably shouldn't be too surprising considering that they were based in Washington, DC, and Alaska was just a small part of their workload. But for Alaskans, air service was a very big deal because the options were extremely limited. In a letter to the head of the Civil Aeronautics Board from George Sundberg and the Alaska Development Board in 1946, Sundberg accurately assessed that in order to develop, Alaska aviation needed more competition rather than less. He drew a contrast to the lower 48, saying that in the States, airlines also had to compete with railroads and bus lines for freight and passenger traffic. But in Alaska, this competition mostly wasn't present, and compounding that, his letter argued, the CAB's rulings would limit the competition between airlines. So Bartlett wrote to Greening in 1950 to complain about the impact of the Civil Aeronautics Act, and of course the board. He said, increasingly, I am inclined to think that the whole act creates a situation the very reverse of free enterprise, is conducive to monopoly, and essentially fails to aid national defense in the way it was expected to. The decisions of the board, he continues, are always in favor of the big established line and against the spirit of competitive enterprise. As Greening colorfully summed it up, he called the CAB the regulatory federal agency wrecking the economy of Alaska. So next, please. So how did Alaska's status as a territory rather than a state impact these interactions with the CAB? There's a couple things to consider, and of course, a lot of it revolves around politics. So first, Alaska's geographic position, its isolation caused some challenges. Alaska was a long way from DC, both geographically and in terms of mindset. Alaska's politicians were well aware of the political sway that the larger lower 48 airlines held, along with the competing economic and political interests between the states and territories. And Bartlett acknowledged the difficulties in advocating for Alaska's air transport industry, in part because of the more interconnected nature of commercial aviation in the lower 48. He talks about how in 1955, about how the local service air carriers in the state had strong support because, quote, the feeder lines touch almost every state and almost every congressional district. He continued, we don't have the political oomph to match. That lack of influence and local control undoubtedly held true for other areas of life in the territory. So I think to a degree, this frustrations with the CAB were just one of many similar issues facing the territory's residents and politicians. Next, please. So what are the big takeaways? My research found ongoing struggles and challenges that were perhaps typical to territorial days, needing more money and investment, but having limited influence and lobbying power to obtain it. They show the tension between different stakeholders in the industry in a territory that had grown to depend heavily on airplanes for its transportation needs. And it seemed that most Alaskans felt that the Civil Aeronautics Act of 1938 failed to meet its goals for encouraging growth and serving the public convenience and necessity. Many seem to agree that in the eyes of the CAB, the needs of the public came second to the needs of the certificated carriers, both in Alaska and elsewhere. And Bartlett called this arrangement, quote, a monopoly with not only the consent of the government, but with the blessing of the government. And lastly, it started to become evident for me during this research that for Alaskans, World War II's history and then that Cold War era tensions and worries were very much on people's minds, as I kept seeing words like dictatorship, monopoly, anti-democratic tendencies, and the like kept coming up, especially in juxtaposition with free enterprise. And overall, this research demonstrated that throughout Alaska's territorial days, there was a disconnect between the CAB and the needs of Alaska aviation. I think it would be really interesting to look at how this compares with other interactions between the territory and federal agencies. But you know, time and resources limited me to where I was here. If you're interested to learn more about aviation development in Alaska in this territorial period, I encourage you to attend Pierce Bateman's session tomorrow about Anchorage's growth as an air crossroads. And thank you so much for your time. I guess there are two more slides. I'm sorry, premature. These are some of the collections I looked at for this research. I love this picture of Bob Bartlett on a bicycle here. I feel like that spirit that was really evident in the tone of a lot of his writings. Lots of great resources on Alaska aviation in the Polar Regions collections. And we can end it there. The last one just says thanks.
We have a few minutes for questions. Here,
Yeah, I got a question for Leanna, so, Leanna, wonderful job, you know, I'm a big fan of your research,
I didn't pay him to say that.
one thing stands out that I find really interesting is something I hadn't put together before, this discussion of, scheduled airlines as monopoly, particularly coming from Greening, is so reminiscent of his calls in the early forties and the beginning of the late forties of steamship companies being a monopoly. Now, and you seem to agree with this critique of scheduled airlines as a monopoly, but I wonder, are there ways in which you know, I guess like a devil's advocate kind of a thing that would have benefited some Alaskans? I think we'd like to complain about federal policies of overreach just as a state and territorial pastime, but I wonder are there ways in which that wasn't that.
So I think in a large part, this was a reaction to the kind of, to use the cliche, Wild West system that had been in place up until 1938. So maybe it was more of an overreaction to go from under regulation to over regulation. And I think that pendulum just kind of kept swinging throughout the period. And then it just with the deregulation much later than my research period, I think that's where it ended. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. We can talk later.
I wonder if this doesn't follow up on that whole theme of Americanization in terms of reading is concerned with global regulation and always looking to have a shot at the federal government. So in a sense, we like to take what the federal government provides, except when it regulates us.
And this look at the CAD came in juxtaposition with last year's research that I did about the CAA, which was the infrastructure building organization, and, you know, provided a lot and demanded comparatively little. People like to see CAA a lot more than the CAD, I think, for that reason. I think it would fit the, we don't like it when you ask us to do things sort of mindset.
John Branson, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
Yeah.
we have the privilege of having a longtime Lake Clark historian here. Did you recognize the first presenter, David? Do you recognize?
Yeah, I've met him in Maine twice.
Oh, wow.
Once when he lived in Arundel, Maine, I went down and saw him because I've been trying to find pictures that Bill Park took around Lake Clark, Fort Allsworth, Canadian Point, and he didn't really have that many. The last time I saw David was in Portland, Maine, and 3 or 4 years ago when he showed me a lot of pictures, but very few from the Lake Clark area. I was very surprised because he went and left his cabin to one of Babe Allsworth's daughters.
Okay. I know it seemed like a lot of the photos are from council and
Yeah,
in the presentation here.
yeah.
Is that the presenter on the line?
David, are you still on the call, David?
I've got his email. I'm gonna email him and tell him that I saw him and liked his presentation. That where's Lake Clark? Clark lived there a long time in Lake Clark.
He's not on.
There I am. Yep.
I forget his name.
David.
Yeah.
Hi, David, this is James Carey, and I read that is there a 1937 date on that, The Land Beyond, because you read a few lines from that. And I have a 37-page typescript of that, and I heard about it from a few people, and John might have even given me the copy, but that one's sprinkled with vocabulary and personal names from people from Lime Village. And it's really stunning, and I knew nothing at all about William Park at all, and we didn't know the convenience. And so the question would be, does he have other writings like that that are full of vocabulary? Because I would know most of those people's descendants between Lime Village and Lake Clark.
What I have is these letters, and there's a lot of information in them. I think actually there's probably more names in the letters that are around early on when he came, and he was talking about all the mining that he was doing and the work, who he was working for and all of that stuff. But yeah, I'm happy to share any of that information, and I actually have found out through this process that my second cousin, who would be Dorothy's son, also has some letters that were sent to her, and so we're going to try to get all of that together. And he actually has some handmade dolls and some other things that Bill had sent. So we're still discovering what's here, but I think it's and eventually it's going to, of course, go to somewhere there, which is where it belongs. So we're sort of learning about it.
Diary type things. He has diaries too.
There are no. He was a letter writer. He did not keep a diary, and nobody from the family, I don't think, cleaned out the cabin in Lake Clark where presumably a bunch of stuff was. It was just left to that other family, the Allsworths, I think their name is. John, who John referred to.
Yeah, Babe and Mary Allsworth.
Yeah.
The cabin, and then Babe gave the land to his daughter, Margaret, and she passed away last winter. And her sons have it now, two sons and a daughter.
Yeah.
And the cabin is it's going downhill. Some some remedial work doesn't get done on it soon, it'll probably collapse.
Oh, that's too bad.
Yeah, because it was built around 1932 or so, and I don't like to be disagreeable, but it wasn't built by Bill Park. It was built by Art Lee and a partner of his named Hugh Ray. And then he must have bought it, Bill must have bought it from Art Lee.
He must have. Yeah, he talks about Lake Clark in his letters a lot. He doesn't mention in his letters that he built the cabin. That's family lore, so that's great to know. You know how this stuff works. It's hard to find the actual story unless you have these materials. So that's what's terrific.
I'm from Hope, Alaska, Resurrection Creek, and he worked at a gold mine 4 miles of Resurrection Creek.
Yeah, there's probably a handful of letters from Hope.
The Hope and Sunrise Historical and Mining Museum would love to have copies.
Oh, send me an email. Happy to share it with you. He actually he explained to my Aunt Barbara, who would have been a young girl at the time. He really explained what a placer mine was, and drew a diagram of it that's really quite remarkable. So I'm happy to share any of that.
As the session winds down, I do want to remind people that Jackie's card, the addendum, We have a bunch of them sitting over here, so be sure to check it out. Are there any online questions?
You can if you're joining us via Zoom, for the business meeting, it is a different link. Please check your email from this morning that I sent around 7 a.m. for that link.
Oh, I'd like to ask David if he has, since you've seen me a few years ago in Portland, Maine, have you come upon any more photographs from the Lake Clark area? Where Bill spent his last days in Alaska on Lake Clark.
I may have some, John. We should send me an email and I can share with you what I have. And I do think my second cousin, has some photos as well, and I'm trying to get those.
Okay, thank you very much.